Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very happy to bring the conversation I had with Benjamin Nathans. Ben is an associate professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania. His main focus areas are on Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union, modern European Jewish history, and history of human rights. He is the author of numerous books, including the most recent, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement, and it is fantastic. It is an absolutely wonderful book. I greatly enjoyed it. It's a big one. It's about 650 pages reading, and then plus with all the notes and everything, it's about 800. But it is the fastest 800 pages you'll read. It's quite good. He does such a good job. It's well written and stringing all the narratives together. So we talk about the book. We talk about how he compiled all of the narratives together, why the Soviet dissident movement matters, and how the Soviet legal system was used during its reign. We talk about the differences between civil disobedience and civil obedience. Alexander Volpin. We talk about the Sinyavsky-Daniel affair. We talk about what rights look like in the Soviet Union. We also talk about the makeup of the dissident movement, Red Square demonstration, initiative group, Fifth Directorate, Solzhenitsyn, other civil rights movements, the legacy of the Soviet dissident movement, and many other topics. This was an absolutely fun conversation to have. Ben is a wonderful, wonderful person, super, super brilliant, extremely great writer, and really just had a great time talking about the lives of these people during the 20th century under the Soviet Union and how they resisted, how they fought back, how they worked within the system, and the lessons we can draw from that today. So it's very, very, very salient for our world and all the things going on, and much to be learned from this period. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube, so like, subscribe, share with your friends, contribute, all the wonderful things. I really, really appreciate it. And now I bring you Benjamin Nathans. I am here with Benjamin Nathans. Ben, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you about your masterful book that you've just put out. So big thanks.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I'm looking forward to speaking with you.
Yeah. Okay, so you have, really, it's a superb book. It really is. I'll ask you a little bit kind of the behind the scenes, I guess, of it, because I'm curious about that. But
Sure.
It's so well put together. It's really good. It's called To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement, out through the wonderful Princeton University Press. And this is just out as of about a week and a half ago. So it's hot off the press. People can go out and get it and order it wherever they get books. So we're going to talk all about this. Now, I will tell folks, this is a big boy. This is almost 800 pages. And I say that to not deter people. It is probably the fastest 650 pages I've read. It's so well written. It's almost narrative form in some ways, and so it's a very easy read in some ways. So it is not the big behemoth that it might seem. So, anyways, I'll talk all about it. Before we do, just tell listeners who you are, what you do professionally, academically, and any relevant details.
Sure. So I go by Ben Nathans, and I am a professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania, where I've been teaching for about a quarter century. I grew up in Baltimore, and I come from a pretty academic family. I have two brothers who are both professors, one a scientist, one a fellow historian. I have lived and studied in various countries, including Israel, the Soviet Union, Germany, and France. My interests were originally in European history, but the first time I visited the Soviet Union was in 1984, and I got the bug. The place just kind of latched on to me. It was the most exotic place I'd ever visited. And For those who are wondering, I started learning Russian after college, so you can actually keep learning after college. Um, and I did my graduate degree at Berkeley with the wonderful historian and mentor Reggie Zelnick.
Mm.
And this book really was a labor of love, a long labor. And most of the time, I just wanted to do justice to the dissidents themselves and also the amazing material that they and the KGB left behind.
How long did it take? I'll say, like, actually, like, writing the book. I mean, sometimes people are like, oh, I chewed on it for a couple years, and then I kind of like. But I guess, like, actually sitting down and writing it. How long would you say it took you? Is it 10 years, 15 years, 5 years? How long did it take you?
I would say the writing process unfolded over the course of about 10 years. And there were some
Wow.
interruptions, other books. I worked on a museum project in Moscow.
Mm.
But it's been gestating for a long time.
Wow. 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 That's incredible. Yeah. So I get the thing about it is that's so incredible is there's the kind of through line which we'll talk about, but how there's so much rich information from almost these um, almost psychological portraits or these character profiles of these people, and you give them time. And I remember reading, I was like, how are we going to get all these stories strung together and kind of like a cohesive thread, and then it really unfolds super nicely. I guess how did it come about where I'm sure you had so many stories and so many things to pull from, and how did you kind of weave it together and organize it the way that you did, of telling all these narrative accounts, illustrating certain points? It does kind of sort of go chronologically. How
Yes.
did you kind of, I mean, I would love to see drafts of your outline.
Mm.
How did you figure it all out to get it cohesively that way?
That's a great question. I mean, you're really talking about the nuts and bolts of the writerly process,
Hmm.
assembling narratives and weaving them with arguments, not losing sight of the red thread that connects everybody and everything. And as you suggested, it took many tries and iterations to arrive at the final product. And I hope it works. It is, as you say, a long book, but the lives that weave their way through it are just so compelling and so interesting, that I think they're ultimately what carry it. But here's the kind of background that I think you're after.
Yeah.
Um, I came to this project having been exposed to a number of memoirs by dissidents.
Mm.
Um, then I started researching that genre systematically and discovered that there are over 150 book length memoirs by former Soviet dissidents, which, as a proportion of total activists in the movement, which was probably never more than about 1,000, is a really high proportion. It's 15% of the movement produced a book length autobiography, and many others produced sort of sketches of their lives that are maybe article length, or were never published. There's quite a bit of unpublished memoir material,
Mm.
and it was a gold mine. I mean, I had so many life stories to draw on, and I really don't think there's another social movement, at least that I know of, anywhere in the world where such a high proportion of participants felt the urge to produce a life story and to make it public.
Mm.
So for an historian to have that depth of memoir literature is a gold mine, but it's also potentially a huge liability, because if you
Mm.
rely too heavily on the memoirs, you reproduce people's own version of their lives, and it
Yeah.
becomes a kind of echo chamber.
Mm-hmm.
So one
Mm-hmm.
of the things that I felt like I had to do to make this work as a narrative was to step outside of those memoir first person accounts. And the thing that more than any other allowed me to do that was um, the interrogation transcripts in the various archives that I worked in. So that allowed me to see what these characters were saying in real time. A memoir, an autobiography, is by definition a retrospective account, and the writing self, age whatever, 50, 60, is making sense of the former self, the historical self. in an interrogation, you're getting a dialogue interaction in real time, and there's no subsequent editing and tailoring of the material to fit a desired life narrative. So every historian at some point or another needs a place to stand outside the memoir literature, just to be able to develop your own perspective, your own interpretation.
Mm.
Another factor was that uh, the dissident movement was covered quite extensively by journalists as it was unfolding. So, these people and their petitions and their protests were making the front pages of the Washington Post and the New York Times and many other sort of top level newspapers across the Western world. They were making headlines, multiple times a month. And the most famous of them, people like Andrei Sakharov, the designer of the Soviet hydrogen bomb, who eventually was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, or people like the writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn, also a Nobel laureate in literature for his epic account of the Gulag. These people were deservedly famous for their professional accomplishments, but they were made globally famous by the spotlight that was cast on them by the Western media. And what I discovered pretty soon after I started getting into my research was that neither of them were really leaders of the movement. Neither of them wanted to be leaders of the movement. Solzhenitsyn really didn't want to be a movement person at all. He was a solo practitioner. He didn't sign group petitions. He never thought of himself as a dissident. He preferred to be known as a Russian writer. And Sakharov similarly was also uncomfortable with the term dissident and really wanted to be known as a physicist, a nuclear physicist or a theoretical physicist. What I discovered was that the people who actually dreamed up the movement and built it and animated it were virtually unknown, both in Russia today and in the West. They turned out to be the real protagonists of my story. And I really wanted to elevate them to a position of prominence in the story. In terms of your question about how to make all these life accounts coherent, here's what I eventually arrived at, and it took a lot of head scratching and turning things over and over and over and trying to see them from different perspectives. The official story that the Soviet Union told about itself for the period after Stalin's death. So Joseph Stalin died in March of 1953, and that really marked a huge turning point in Soviet history. The second half of that history is very different from the first half. Every society has a story that it tells about itself in order to make sense of itself. And what the Soviet Union, the Soviet story about itself was, we are working towards the transition from socialism to communism. So the state is going to wither away and everybody shall receive according to their need and give according to their ability. It was the Marxist utopia of a state, a country without a state, without a police, with no crime, with no class conflict, because there would be only one class, the workers. The actual story, I think, of the second half of Soviet history is the attempt to exit totalitarianism. Not to give up one-party rule, not to give up the centralized command economy, but to do away with the technique of state-sponsored political terror against real or perceived enemies in the population. And it's that attempt to exit a dictatorial totalitarian system that I think is the real drama of the second half of Soviet history. And that story is not over today.
It's very, very well explained. I think anyone that reads the book would be curious for, again, like I said, the kind of way in which you weaved all of these stories together. We'll talk about many of those themes. The one question here is, you talk about how the dissident story in the Soviet Union for much of the 20th century is how it illustrates a more universal struggle between hopelessness and perseverance within the contemporary world. And I guess the question here, aside from historically or, people that are still, during the Soviet Union, are obviously still alive and, why should we care about these stories? Why should we know these stories? obviously you talked about it was reported during the time, but now, 30, what is it, 30, 35 years after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Yep.
I mean, I'm sure we might talk about it as a kind of, epilogue of sorts about the current conflict in Russia, but I'm not even thinking about that at the moment. I'm just saying generally for a kind of global international understanding, why should this story be important for us to, or these stories, I should say, with all these folks, these memoirs from the dissident movement, how does it have, I guess, saliency for many activists or protests or big movements or whatever it may be globally?
Yeah. That's a very eloquent version of the so what question. So what? And I have a couple of responses. The first is the history of freedom, of the way people think about freedom, of the way they strive to attain it, what it means to them, how it changes over time, I think is both intrinsically interesting and significant. And Soviet dissidents were carrying on a very elaborate, rich conversation about inner freedom, social freedom, what it means to live like a free person under unfree circumstances. And that's something that I think will in some ways always be relevant because there are always
Mm.
elements of unfreedom. We experience them ourselves in our own society. Um, we experience that technologically with the inroads of surveillance, especially hidden surveillance in our lives, and with restrictions that are placed or threatened to be placed on what we can do and say by various entities. Sometimes it's the state, sometimes it's our fellow citizens. So the struggle to live free lives is, in a sense, never over. It's ongoing. Another, I think, reason to be interested in this story now in today's world, our world, including our American world, is that, among other things, this is a story about the attempt to make real human rights that are now a global issue. And I think it's very important not to see human rights as simply a Western export product that gets translated to the rest of the world, which passively receives these ideas. And among other things, the story of the Soviet dissident movement is the story of an attempt to arrive at a way of thinking about human rights, what they are, how they can be deployed in a very non Western, non democratic setting. And let's face it, we live in a world today that is mostly non Western and non democratic. And so that context is, I think, extremely important to anybody who cares about the future of human rights and how they get
Mm.
mobilized.
Mm.
And then I think on the most universal level, if you take the title of the book, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, which I stole verbatim from the dissidents themselves. It was their favorite toast as they were sitting around countless kitchen tables in Moscow and Leningrad and Kiev and other Soviet cities. This combination of hopelessness but determination to pursue after to pursue one's goals nonetheless, I think is psychologically extremely valuable. We today, and when I say we, I mean people in the United States, but not only in the United States, we encounter certain forms of hopelessness and despair. Are we really equal to the challenge of global warming? Can we rise to the challenge of actually doing something about that problem? Can we do something about the seemingly ever increasing inequality in our society and the apparent decline of social mobility, options for social mobility? These are big, deep structural problems. And a lot of people, I think, are teetering on a kind of precipice of despair that no matter what great ideas this or that person can come up with, we simply don't have the willpower or the ability to arrive at the kind of consensus that would produce a robust response to those problems. If you
Yeah.
read this book about Soviet dissidents, I think if the only thing you come away with is a sense of, wow, these people faced immeasurably greater obstacles than we did. They had many fewer options than we do. And the grounds for being optimistic about dissent in the Soviet Union were even narrower and thinner than our grounds for hope today, then I think it can be a source of inspiration. And if that's the takeaway from readers of the book, I'll be very happy.
Yeah, that's very well said. With that, there's, I would say, the major theme. I'd say the crucial variable for the book, which you mention it many times in the book, and I'm sure we will here, is this wasn't a a gathering of people one day in a room, and they all said, you know what, we got to fight back, and let's organize a protest and a rally and whatever. Again, not to say that there aren't movements that have done that are wrong or bad or whatever, but the interesting thing about this, and this is the hook for me for the book, was that it appealed to Soviet and international law. That it was, how did they use, which is wild to me, how did they use their current system of Soviet reality, Soviet law, Soviet, and how within that they were to say, basically within itself, say, this doesn't hold, or this is inconclusive, or this is contradictory. So see, you can't do it this way. They worked literally within their legal system, within their structural system, which was a totalitarian state, which was, a Marxist state. How, we'll talk about some of the big figures in a minute, but just generally, if this theme of doing it this way, and then not initially everyone being on the same page. It almost was this kind of serendipitous, like, yeah, I'm going to do it this way, and somebody else over here is doing it this way, and a couple years later, someone else is doing it this way. It all kind of coalesced together in that way. How did that feels unique for this movement? I mean, I'm not, maybe other places have done it or places have done it afterwards, but there's something very powerful in that. How did that kind of form, and what's the genesis of that, I guess?
Sure. So the strategy that you're talking about is the deceptively simple idea that if you can just get the Soviet government to live up to its own laws, to observe its own constitution, you've already gone a long way towards containing and limiting the arbitrariness of the state. And that was hugely significant because the Soviet government, especially under Stalin, at the peak moments of state-sponsored political violence, was really a kind of a lawless entity. It was an entity that was not constrained by legal rules and not really subject to any meaningful legal constraints. So you asked not so much what was the strategy, but how did they arrive at it? It seems kind of counterintuitive. So I think the first thing, just psychologically, I mean, you're a psychologist, so I think you'll enjoy this, is that as with so many things in life, it's much easier to be clear about what you don't want to do and what you're against than what you're for. And what the dissidents knew just instinctively is that they did not want to reproduce the model of underground revolutionary conspiracy. They did not want to take the Bolshevik template and found yet another revolutionary movement bent on the overthrow of the state. These are people who were all born after the revolution. They lived through the period of very violent construction of this new society, unprecedented in world history. And if there's one thing they knew, it's that they'd had enough of revolution. So the common denominator from the get-go was whatever strategy dissent would take, it had to be peaceful. It had to be nonviolent. And of course, there was something very pragmatic about that too. The state exercised a virtual monopoly on the use of violence in public life, and there was just virtually no hope of being able to overcome that. The genesis, the sort of the genealogy of the strategy really goes back to a mathematician, a very eccentric, brilliant mathematician named Alexander Volpin, who was born in 1924 and not only studied mathematics, but was really interested in mathematical logic, that is sort of the nature of proofs and the nature of truth statements within the field of math. And Volpin became interested in whether he could develop what was known as an ideal language, a perfect language which was free of all the ambiguity of human languages like English, where words have multiple meanings and those meanings are context dependent, and all of the kind of ambiguity and confusion that comes from using human languages. He was, in a sense, part of a global movement. There was Norbert Wiener at MIT, who was the father of cybernetics, and the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein at Oxford was interested in ideal language philosophy. And Volpin sort of shared in this utopian dream of actually creating a new language. And he wrote at one point that it's only when we develop that kind of language that we'll really be able to trust our own thinking, because we will have arrived at a medium for thinking that is perfectly transparent. Well, long story short, neither he nor anybody else ever successfully created or founded a perfect language. I suppose you could say computer scientists and software engineers are still working on it. But Volpin sort of conceded defeat, even as he came up with a plan B, which was to use the closest approximation to a language that was super transparent and explicit about things like what you may do, what you may not do, what you should do, what you are forbidden to do, all of the sort of basic behavioral injunctions. And that was the language of law. And specifically in his case, Soviet law, which he first encountered after being arrested for writing some irreverent poems in the 1940s, the late 1940s. This is still under Stalin. So Volpin is kind of the intellectual godfather of this approach. And as you mentioned, disseminating this idea was not an easy matter, because most people's response to his thinking was, why are you even taking Soviet law seriously? Everybody knows that it's just a facade, and the government routinely disobeys its own constitutional articles and provisions. And Volpin's response was, that's precisely the problem, is that everybody dismisses law as meaningless, whereas if we were to assert the meaningfulness of Soviet law and insist on fidelity to that law, we might actually begin to get some traction from it. So it's a brilliantly simple strategy. It's kind of counterintuitive, and it formed. This is not the dissidents term. It's something that I applied to the movement. It formed the basis of a strategy of what I call civil obedience. This is in contrast to the traditions of civil disobedience that go back to Henry Thoreau and Lev Tolstoy and Mahatma Gandhi and Rosa Parks.
Yeah, you talk about that, maybe just as a kind of footnote here, that kind of difference that you see between civil disobedience and civil obedience. How do you see the distinction there?
Well, the logic of civil disobedience is that protesters who find this or that law unjust from a moral standpoint, and in Henry David Thoreau's case in the middle of the 19th century, it was he refused to pay taxes to a government that was waging an aggressive war against Mexico. And he knew that not paying taxes was illegal, and he was ready to go to jail. But he thought he could highlight and call attention to the immorality of that war by intentionally disobeying the law of paying taxes to the government. Mahatma Gandhi also engaged in civil disobedience in an effort to highlight the injustice of British colonial rule in India. And Rosa Parks famously engaged in civil disobedience by sitting down on a bus in Memphis in a place reserved for white people, deliberately violating the legal segregation, the whole regime known as Jim Crow law in the American South, in an attempt to call attention to how morally repugnant it was, but also to get the federal government. The hope was to get the federal government to come in and essentially override Jim Crow segregation law. Soviet dissidents took the opposite strategy. Civil obedience is about engaging in behaviors like free speech, free assembly, that are explicitly protected and sanctified by the Soviet Constitution, which they were, in an effort to demonstrate the limits of legal behavior, to show what is in fact legal, and to pressure the Soviet government itself to abide by its own laws. So civil obedience means the dissidents will do nothing illegal. They are not going to violate any laws. They're actually going to engage in behaviors that are explicitly protected, and they're going to call out the Soviet government if and when it engages in behaviors that are not legal. So it's diametrically the opposite of civil disobedience.
Interesting here. It does seem like this is dependent on what is the structure generally, but legal structure within the country, right? So within the United States in the 1950s in the American South, yeah, maybe that wouldn't have worked so well. But you can make an argument that maybe in some places today that would work much better for civil obedience than disobedience. Not sure on that, but it does. Either way, the point is that it does seem these things are dependent on whatever the established structure is within the country or the jurisdiction or wherever it is. Is that about right?
Oh, that's absolutely right. And one of the things that made civil disobedience have traction in the American setting is that American law is hierarchical. It's divided into different levels. There's state law and there's federal law, and sometimes those systems are in tension with each other. And one of the purposes of civil disobedience in the American South in the 1950s and 60s was to highlight the tension between local discriminatory law and federal law. That's how you got the National Guard in to desegregate public schools. The National Guard is the National Guard. That's the federal government essentially imposing its will, if by force, if necessary, to trump local law. The other structural element of the American system that was crucial here is that we have the principle of judicial review, meaning a court, especially a high court, can nullify or overturn a law passed by a legislature, state legislature, if it is found to be unconstitutional. So there are mechanisms within the American legal system for confronting contradictions between state and federal level.
Yeah.
Neither of those mechanisms existed in the Soviet legal system. And honestly, the United States is an outlier when it comes to judicial review. Most countries do not allow judges, even courts that have 9 judges on them. They don't allow them to overturn laws in the name of protecting the Constitution. So the Soviet Union was actually more typical in that way. But there was no distinction between local and, well, I shouldn't say there's no distinction. There was no mechanism for forcing a reconciliation between local and union-wide law in the Soviet Union. And in fact, the strategy of civil disobedience, when it appealed to the Soviet government to honor its own legal statutes, failed in the end. The Soviet government never responded to petitions highlighting these contradictions. And so that eventually produced a kind of tactical shift in the dissident movement where they appealed to international law and international human rights norms. Now we have something that's sort of structurally parallel to the situation inside the United States, where dissidents are appealing to international bodies, especially the United Nations, but not only, in an effort to say, look, the Soviet Union has signed these international human rights agreements, but the behavior of the Soviet government is inconsistent with those agreements, so we need to reconcile them. The difference, of course, is that the United Nations doesn't have an army. The United Nations doesn't really have an enforcement mechanism for its own human rights accord. So there was no equivalent to the National Guard going into Little Rock, Arkansas to impose desegregation on high schools. But structurally, there were some parallels.
Yeah, this is very, very interesting. So you mentioned Volpin. He'll come up again. He arranges meetings and things of this sort. But let's talk about help me here on my Russian here on the Sinyavsky. How do I say this?
Yes.
Sinyavsky. Thank you. Daniel affair. Two gentlemen, and this became kind of the I don't want to say watershed, but maybe a hallmark moment for the Soviet dissident movement. You talk about it as the first civil rights movement in a socialist world. Very interesting there. And how they used writing. So their writing was, my understanding on this was, it wasn't that they were, on a legal standpoint, not that they were writing certain things, fiction, nonfiction, but the fact that it was being distributed in the Western world and more internationally. That was the issue. That was the problem that the Soviet Union had. So maybe just kind of give us the overview of their their stories and how it kind of went to court and how these kind of things played out a bit.
Sure. Yeah. So the people that you are referring to are Yuli Daniel and Andrei Sinyavsky, um, both of whom had what you might call day jobs, totally legit day jobs. Daniel was a translator, and Sinyavsky was a literary critic, rather prominent one. But under pseudonyms, they, after hours, were writing works of fiction that could not possibly get published in the Soviet Union because they were satirical and they were playing in a kind of experimental way, both with the content of Soviet reality, making it surreal, bending it, raising very troubling moral issues about Soviet values and Soviet life. And they were also bending the rules stylistically. That is, they were not adhering to the official genre of socialist realism, in which everything promotes the revolution and the building of a socialist society. And they would read their stories out loud to friends in their apartment. Some of them circulated in a system known as samizdat, where people would hand type copies and then distribute them almost like a chain letter. So if you got a copy, in return for the privilege of access to that text, you would agree to type maybe 10 copies yourself and then distribute those. So it was almost like a chain letter. But what really got attention to these underground texts, these fictional stories, was that they were smuggled abroad. Sinyavsky and Daniel were both acquainted with the daughter of the naval attaché at the French embassy. And the daughter had diplomatic privileges as a member of a diplomatic family, and she was able to smuggle these texts out to France. And from there, they were published in the West, both in Russian and in many translations, French, English, German, you name it. Now, according to the Soviet Criminal Code, there was no law barring the publication of works abroad. And it was very difficult for the KGB, first of all, to figure out who these authors actually were because they were publishing under pseudonyms. But it was also a tricky thing to sort of nail the charge of anti-Soviet propaganda against them because these are works of fiction. And as you know, in a work of fiction, it's not always clear what the author thinks or what the author is trying to get the reader to think. Right. So, long story short, it took the KGB about a decade to finally figure out who these pseudonyms actually belong to. And it's an amazing detective story involving, the forensic analysis of typewriters and all kinds of false leads about who these writers actually were. And in the end, the investigation concluded almost exactly where it began, which was among the literary elite in Moscow. Mm-hmm. So the KGB, having cracked the code, finally arrest Daniel and Sinyavsky in September of 1965 without announcing what the charges are going to be. Just these two writers are going to be arrested. And this sends shockwaves through the Soviet intelligentsia because just a year earlier, in October of 1964, Nikita Khrushchev, who was the immediate successor to Joseph Stalin, was essentially yanked from power. It was kind of a palace coup d'etat. People had grown tired of his erratic policymaking. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a humiliating event for the Soviet Union. Anyway, he was something that had never happened before in Soviet history. A Soviet leader didn't die in office like Lenin and Stalin had. He was simply removed. And in September of 1965, not even a year has gone by. Nobody knows what's happening. Is there going to be a return to Stalinism? Khrushchev had presided over this, what he called the thaw in Soviet politics, this kind of reform, liberalizing moment. And when Khrushchev was yanked from the Kremlin, there was panic. And when Sinyavsky and Daniel were arrested, people thought, oh boy, here we go again. They're going to be show trials. They're going to arrest writers and artists and intellectuals. We're going right back to the height of the terror of the 1930s. So Volpin was one of the people who shared that anxiety, but unlike virtually everybody else, he decided to do something about it. And what he decided to do was to organize a protest, not against, I shouldn't even call it a protest. It was going to be a public meeting, not to say these writers are innocent, how dare you arrest them, not to say, these are works of fiction, you can't prosecute people for writing works of fiction. He wasn't even interested in what they had written. All he wanted to do was to ensure that the trial of the writers lived up to the Code of Criminal Procedure, and above all, that it was an open trial, so that the evidence presented and the testimony could be subject to the scrutiny of the Soviet population. So he called this meeting the Glasnost meeting, and Glasnost is a Russian term meaning transparency or openness. And the meeting was held on December 5th, 1965, which is the anniversary of the ratification of the Soviet Constitution of 1936. So it was held on Constitution Day. And again, this gets back to the philosophy of civil obedience. The idea was, okay, you're going to have a trial of these writers. Make sure it lives up to all of the relevant statutes of the Soviet Constitution and the Code of Criminal Procedure. And that was a kind of a minimalist demand. It wasn't down with the Communist Party or writers are innocent, how dare you put them on trial. It's just trial should be open and it should conform to Soviet criminal procedure.
Can you tell us, I guess, a bit here, because of how important this is? And we've talked about a few players here. I mean, you don't have to give me the all of it, but generally, as it pertains to, I guess, the dissident movement, what do we understand about rule of law in the Soviet Union? What kinds of rights did people have during the Soviet Union, particularly during this time that you're discussing, the 60s, 70s, into the 80s?
Sure.
What were some of the general or major rights that are kind of germane to the topic of the dissident movement?
Yeah. So there are rights on paper and there are rights in practice. And they hardly ever match up perfectly. And in some systems, they are mismatched egregiously. So on paper, which is to say in the Soviet Constitution, there are very clear, robust civil liberties, the guarantee of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. It's true that those freedoms are circumscribed by the greater need to strengthen and defend the socialist system, but the language is quite strong. And in some ways, the language goes beyond just saying these rights are guaranteed by law. One of the great innovations of Soviet legal thought and of the Soviet legal system was the idea that it's not enough to simply guarantee rights or to simply say, we're going to have freedom of speech because the government is not going to interfere in speech. The Soviets took socialism seriously, including as it pertains to civil liberties. Their idea was bourgeois countries, Western countries, have had these rights on the books for decades. And yet, in the opinion of people like Vladimir Lenin, the father of the Russian Revolution, those rights were fake. They were bogus. They were a facade. They didn't really govern the exercise of power. And as one sort of witty journalist once put it, freedom of the press only belongs to those who own the press. And the Bolshevik innovation in the history of civil liberties was to say, it's not enough for the government to refrain from censorship. The government the state has to ensure for real freedom of speech and freedom of the press to exist, it has to ensure that everybody has access to the material goods that you need to exercise those rights. It's not enough to say we have a free press. You have to give paper and printing machines to the workers. It's not enough to say freedom of assembly. You can have a demonstration whenever you want. You have to actually provide spaces, rooms, meeting halls, auditoriums, heating, light to make those rights real.
It sounds like I remember watching this a couple years ago where it was really it still happens here too where Bernie Sanders said something like, "Yeah, you have rights, but you don't have access to them. So what's the point of having rights if you can't have access to them? You can say yes, you have rights to good education or rights to good healthcare, but if you don't have access to it or you for various reasons." Well, what good is it, right? So people sometimes it's a kind of like, yeah, we agree with that, or yeah, we're going to do that, and then it's like, yeah, but there's no accessibility. Access is also a big part of it. It sounds like, I mean, I'm not trying to compare, but it sounds like there's that this kind of problem of accessibility is key here.
Oh, I think the comparison is completely legitimate, and it's part of the position of being a social democrat or a socialist, that the material conditions have a huge impact on whether these rights become realizable or not. And the earlier and in some way more fundamental version of what you just said is the slogan, human rights begin with breakfast. If you're hungry, if your energy and your attention and your daily life is all about just getting enough food to eat, you can't possibly be in a position to exercise free speech in a situation where it's controversial, let alone freedom of the press and freedom of assembly. So the Soviet logic took those ideas, human rights begin with breakfast, and the material prerequisites for actually exercising rights. It took that idea very seriously, at least on paper in the Constitution. Anybody who studies the Stalin era knows that civil liberties were just massively violated for tens of millions of people. So there was just the largest gap you can imagine between the theory as captured in the Constitution and the lived reality. And what Volpin wanted to do was to change the lived reality to conform to the more or less ideal language of rights that was found in the Soviet Constitution. But he didn't subscribe to the idea that it was the government's responsibility to provide the material prerequisites. Samizdat, which was the technique of typing your own texts and operating under the radar of the official system of publishing, was basically a way of saying, we'll take care of the material prerequisites. All we really need is paper and typewriters and carbon paper. What we need the government to do is to refrain from censoring what we've written and for punishing people who produce or consume or disseminate these underground samizdat texts.
I guess in this period, you have enough people making some noise. Obviously, Volpin. Obviously, we have this affair goes all the way to court with the two gentlemen. How do we start in the '60s? I guess mid to late '60s, start to see more of a forming of the movement. This is what was really interesting for me. Was yeah, you have some incidents or whatever, but for things to sort of catch fire, for there to be a movement, where there's not secret underground meetings, but people are doing sort of on their own thing, but how are they all kind of cohesive in this? Are there arrests, demonstrations, trials? Like how did this start to come about? And kind of second to that, you can kind of talk about the makeup of the movement, which you talk about as a truly multi-ethnic, diverse group of people that transcended race, ethnicity, townships, religion, all these other things. It wasn't centered on race or what ethnic group or what religion you were. There was a different central focus here, and to have a truly multi-ethnic kind of movement. So, yeah. How did it start to kind of like form into that kind of movement where people were sort of checking out what everyone was doing, and then what was, I guess, like kind of the makeup of the folks that were in this with a kind of central aim?
Yeah. Let me go back to a phrase you used at the beginning of this question about sort of when do you get to a point where enough people are making noise to be noticed?
Yeah.
One of the extraordinary things that I found about the movement was how small it was. If you describe as a dissident someone who at some point was willing to sign their name to a public letter or petition targeting addressed to the Soviet government or the United Nations or any other addressee, number of people who took that step, and just that alone could get you in a huge amount of trouble, up to and including arrest. It probably was never more than about 1,000 people. This in a
Wow.
country at the time of,
Wow.
240 million. So we're talking about really a drop in the ocean. But what's so extraordinary is that even that tiny number of people succeeded in garnering attention way out of proportion with their number. And I mean attention at home and particularly attention globally. So this is one of the great enigmas of this story is how did so few people
Hmm.
exercise such an outsized kind of influence on the history of the Cold War and the history of the Soviet Union from inside? So let's talk a little bit about who those people were, since you
Yeah.
you, you asked about that. You're absolutely right. They were extraordinarily diverse when it came to their ethnic background, where they came from. Also, men and women were both strongly represented in this movement. This was not a movement in which the leadership or the rank and file were overwhelmingly male. In fact, women played some crucial roles in the dissemination of samizdat and in the most important and long-lived samizdat periodical, the so-called Chronicle of Current Events.
Mm.
The one way, however, in which this movement was very unrepresentative of the population as a whole is that it was composed overwhelmingly of intellectuals, people who belonged to the class known in Russian history as the intelligentsia, people who had a college education, and in some cases, a graduate education.
Mm.
So, in that respect, they were extremely unrepresentative of the Soviet population as a whole. And this was, of course, a great concern because the movement did not have deep roots outside the intelligentsia.
Mm.
And if the goal of the movement was to spread a new kind of legal consciousness and to make people take Soviet law seriously, they were going to have to break out of the intelligentsia and reach, the peasants and the workers and the people who lived
Mhm.
outside towns and cities. And that was a constant challenge for this
Mm.
movement.
It's really fascinating. It's interesting how again a small group of I guess well-educated people were able to have that impact, and then it does kind of have a high point with this Red Square demonstration in August of '68.
Yeah,
Um, Listen, 1968 was a pretty wild year
it was a hell of a year around the world.
in, in the U.S., but also around the world. I mean, I don't know how the stars aligned or something, but 1968 is a pretty wild year.
Yep.
Um, yeah, tell us about this Red Square demonstration and what that did for the dissident movement, what it didn't do, where it pushed it into different places. Because as you're saying, you have a small group of people. How does it start to reach out into kind of peasants, kind of the working class folks? Like, how did people start to kind of get involved with this, or did that not happen? How important was this Red Square demonstration?
Sure. So the Red Square demonstration, as you mentioned, was in August of 1968, August 25th to be specific. And it was a protest against the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. And that invasion was designed to crush a reform movement that had been gathering steam in Prague and elsewhere in Czechoslovakia for the past 6 months. Needless to say, there's some pretty interesting parallels to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Um, uh, it's not an exact echo, but there are lots of similarities, including the reaction within the Russian population to the shocking news of the invasion of
Mm.
essentially an allied country, a country with very close ties to Russia itself. So let me back up just a little bit. Um, the the first so-called transparency meeting that Volpin organized is in December of '65. Um, the Sinyavsky-Daniel trial is held in February of 1966. There are protests at that trial. A secret transcript of the trial is created and disseminated via samizdat. The compilers of that transcript are arrested. There are protests on their behalf. And before you know it, you have a kind of chain reaction of arrests, trials, protests, more arrests, more secret transcripts. And it's not as if anybody is planning all of these things. The dissidents are simply reacting kind of day by day to the local events. And the ethos of the movement is it's going to be non-hierarchical. There aren't going to be leaders and followers. Everybody is going to follow their own conscience, their own sort of moral intuition about what principles deserve to be defended publicly and how. The chain reaction continues for about 3 years until 1968. And by the time you get to early 1968, some people within the movement are saying, it's all fine and good to just let this kind of random process of protests and demonstrations and arrests continue. But if we're really going to get things done, we need to organize. We need to have an actual structure. We need to have a division of labor where certain people are responsible for this and other people are responsible for that. And there are leadership positions. And a lot of people say, no. That's what the Bolsheviks did. We don't want to go anywhere near the kind of model of revolutionary conspiratorial parties where there are commands given and people have to obey those commands. There's a real tension within the party between the proponents of hierarchy and organization and explicit strategizing and the people who want to continue this kind of spontaneous chain reaction model.
Okay,
so the Soviet Union invades Czechoslovakia. And all of the dissidents, and many people who were not dissidents, but who were sort of progressive in their views about reforming the Soviet system, they were extremely distraught at this invasion because the Czechs and the Slovaks had been enacting exactly the kind of reforms that the Soviet dissidents had been hoping to enact inside the USSR. The Prague Spring, this reform program, was an inspiration, and people were hoping there would be a Moscow Spring along the same lines, and then to watch their own country crush and strangle the Czechoslovak reform movement was just unbearable. And the people who were the strongest proponents of spontaneous chain reaction, conscience-driven protest decided they can't reverse the invasion, but at least they could let the world know, and especially let Czechs and Slovaks know, that some people inside the Soviet Union were not supporters of that invasion. Because the Kremlin was broadcasting these headlines that the Soviet population unanimously supports this intervention on behalf of our brothers, the Czechs and the Slovaks, the whole propaganda line. 8 people decided to organize their own protest in Red Square. And Red Square is, it's the most famous piece of real estate in the entire Soviet Union. It's the symbolic center of the Soviet universe. And they organize a protest. Only 8 people show up. They have a miscommunication with Western journalists who came an hour too early, so there are no photographs of this event. We only know about it from the KGB records and the memoirs of the participants, but it sends shockwaves across Moscow, the Soviet Union, and the world. And one of the reasons it does so is that Western media covered the event immediately and broadcast news about it through shortwave radio stations, Voice of America, Radio Liberty, the Deutsche Welle. And so news of the protest reaches millions of Soviet listeners within hours of the event. That's not supposed to be possible when there's an Iron Curtain, but it is possible thanks to the sort of the internet of its day, shortwave radio broadcasting.
It's really, really interesting. It's again, it's not like the big fanfare, 8 people show up, but how much of an impact it has. It's really interesting how a small amount can have such a ripple.
Yeah.
You talk about a few other things. You talk about the initiative group, creating more formal roles. You also talk about the 5th directorate, which I thought was also interesting, trying to stifle the dissident movement. Maybe talk about these 2 pieces here, about how you start to see more formation, if you will, to these things, trying to put more kind of meat on it, and trying to say, okay, we got a skeleton here. How do we kind of fill in the gaps? How do we get this a little more organized? And then the counter to that, which is trying to stifle it as well.
Yep.
Tell us about these things.
Sure. It's it's almost like a choreography, a dance between these 2 parties, and each one is reacting to the moves of the other. So it's the decision by Khrushchev in the late 50s, after Stalin finally dies, it's the decision to remove mass terror from the repertoire of governing practices that creates the space in which a dissident movement can form. There couldn't have been anything like the Soviet dissident movement under Stalin. They just would have all been killed instantly, arrested and executed. So the birth of the movement is a reaction to a shift in governing practices. Then the KGB looks at these people and says, wow, so they're not monarchists, they're not nationalists, they're not claiming to be the true Leninists who are going to overthrow this corrupt Soviet system and really build genuine socialism. In other words, they're not familiar. They're not part of the familiar lineup that the KGB has developed expertise in dismantling and crushing. They're constitutionalists. They're people asking that the Soviet Constitution be honored. So how do you go after them? There's a lot of confusion in the KGB. And the KGB itself is trying to operate under the rule of law insofar as it can, since it's no longer allowed just to beat up people and arrest them and execute them. So there is this kind of dance going on. And then, as I mentioned a minute ago, inside the Soviet dissident movement, there's also some tension between the fans of spontaneous, conscience-driven protest on the one hand, and those who think we have got to get organized. We've got to have more systematic approach to what we're doing, and we need hierarchy, we need leaders. Well, in a sense, the demonstration on Red Square in August of 1968 it doesn't settle that argument, but it ends it, because the fans of spontaneous protest, they're the ones who are out on Red Square, and they're all arrested. So they are essentially removed from the drama. And that leaves the field to those who favor organization. And sure enough, not long after the demonstration on Red Square, a new entity emerges, the first official dissident organization, which you mentioned, called the Initiative Group. And this is a group that is going to publicly announce itself almost as a kind of NGO, a non-governmental organization, a rights advocacy organization whose brief is to defend the constitutional rights of individual Soviet citizens. So this is a real turning point in the history of the movement. And the Initiative Group takes upon itself the job of compiling dossiers about specific cases where the Soviet government has violated either Soviet law or international human rights norms, and making those dossiers available to the Soviet public and to Western entities such as the United Nations and the Red Cross. So it's an extraordinarily brave thing to do. The actual genesis of the Initiative Group is a fascinating story of betrayal, deception, and lots of things that don't sit well with dissident values, but which we now know actually happened. And I try to bring that to light. The KGB, under its new director as of 1967, Yuri Andropov, is also trying to adjust its game to deal with this new kind of internal threat, namely the dissidents. And it's Andropov, one of the first things he does after becoming head of the KGB is to create a new subdivision, which he calls the Fifth Directorate. And the Fifth Directorate's responsibility is to manage, contain, and eventually destroy the dissident movement. And I have a whole chapter about how the Fifth Directorate operated. The gist of the story is that even though trials of dissidents, without exception, always produced a guilty verdict, they always produced the legal outcome that the government wanted. And let's face it, it's not accidental that happened, because the government got on the telephone and said to the judge, you're going to find these people guilty and you're going to sentence them to X number of years in the labor camp. They did this before the trial began. This is what Russians call law by telephone. But even though the legal outcome went exactly according to plan, the public relations outcome was a disaster. The Sinyavsky-Daniel trial produced convictions of the two writers, and one was sentenced to 5 years in the Gulag and one was sentenced to 7 years in the Gulag. Daniel got 5 years because of his military service in the Second World War, which was seen as a mitigating factor. But the PR outcome was catastrophic, because it made the government look like it was going backwards towards the Stalinist model, and all kinds of holes in the prosecution's argument came to light thanks to the secret transcript of the trial that was created. And this happened over and over and over again. The government got the legal outcome that it wanted, but the political dividends of putting dissidents on trial were not working for the state. They were enhancing the reputation of the movement. These trials were creating globally famous martyrs out of people who nobody had heard of before. And so the Fifth Directorate took on a new strategy. Don't put dissidents on trial. Don't use the legal system to combat this movement. Instead, use extrajudicial techniques like calling people into the KGB and threatening them, saying, if you continue to meet with so-and-so, your child will never get into a university. You will be fired from your job. Your wife won't be able to work. Any number of extrajudicial punishments which were unconstrained by any legal statutes. It was just the KGB doing what it needed to do to intimidate people from either joining the movement or continuing to work for the movement. They also, instead of putting people on trial, would send them to psychiatric hospitals. People who were absolutely mentally healthy, beyond the shadow of a doubt. And once you entered that hospital, there was no telling when or if you would ever get out. And in the most egregious cases, they not only put people in mental institutions who had no business being there, but they subjected them to antipsychotic drugs, which essentially disabled their ability to read and to write and to think. And this was the Soviet version of psychological warfare. The American version of psychological warfare, this is part of the Cold War, non-military combat. American psychological warfare was about using ideas to threaten and destabilize the socialist system. And that meant smuggling books and articles and subsidizing these shortwave radio stations. So getting ideas across the Soviet border. The Soviet version of psychological warfare is disabling the ability of certain dissidents to even think.
It's so interesting how they started to go outside the legal capacity of things and just bully and make threats, but it does seem like they were worried. Like it was a real threat. It was a concern. You're not going to do all of this if you're not actually worried about it being legitimate. Like there's some traction here. It sounds like there was some, I guess you could say, fear about what this could do.
Yep. I mean, the evidence from the Soviet archives is overwhelming. The highest levels of the Communist Party and the security apparatus, which means the KGB, they took this movement dead seriously, despite the relatively small numbers of people involved. They sensed the vulnerability of the Soviet system. I think they sensed it in a way that many people in the West did not.
Super. It's a very curious thing. Again, there's all these twists and turns with how there's some of the uniqueness with this. So Solzhenitsyn, I mean, he's more well known, and thanks to certain people more recently in the past couple of years, he's become even more well known. I want to know historically the right way to view how he thought he was doing, to view how he viewed himself and what he thought he was doing, what he was up to, and a sort of historical accuracy, as best we know, about what he was doing, both with the Gulag Archipelago and obviously with other works such as the Cancer Ward and there's another one, I'm forgetting the name.
In the First Circle.
The first, yes. I feel like a lot of people, people do this generally, but a lot of people, they get hooked on one person or certain aspects, and they interpret it how they want for their own means, and it's not truly. It's at the very least historically inaccurate or misrepresenting what the person did at the time, what they were aiming to do, and even how they viewed themselves about it. So how do we have a kind of a more accurate, maybe a more sobering view of Solzhenitsyn, not one where we're necessarily, you know, lionizing him and deifying him of sorts. But what's the kind of reality of himself, but also his work at the time, and then kind of subsequently, I guess.
Yeah. I don't think anyone would dispute that Alexander Solzhenitsyn was one of the towering figures of the 20th century, and arguably the most politically influential writer of the second half of the 20th century. He really did launch a kind of one-man campaign to discredit the entire Soviet project, root and branch. And the amount of just sheer willpower, courage, and self-confidence and determination that it took to wage that campaign in the face of ferocious attacks and harassment by the Soviet government, including the KGB, really deserves to be highlighted. And I just actually got finished reading the uncensored original full edition of In the First Circle this summer. And
nice. How is it?
It's a fantastic novel. It is.
I have to look. I've read it.
You probably read the 1968 version, which was published in the West under the title First Circle.
I think that's right. That's right. It's a big book, right? It's a big book.
It is big. Well, the unedited one, the uncensored one, is even bigger. It's about 150 pages, and it's called, the original Russian title is In the First Circle. So I highly recommend it. I mean, it's a Cold War suspense novel that also plumbs the depths of Gulag psychology, the experience of prisoners, and it's fantastic. It may be the best novel Solzhenitsyn ever wrote. But Solzhenitsyn was much more than just a writer of great novels. He also became a politically relevant figure, really in some ways second to none. So initially, the West, and particularly the United States, did what it kind of always does. We have a very powerful celebrity culture in this country, and Solzhenitsyn was transformed into a celebrity. And I think the United States was particularly drawn to him in the 1960s and early 70s because he seemed to be a freedom fighter. And we have this tendency to sort of project our own values, and obviously the value of freedom is hardwired into American DNA. I mean, that's kind of the narrative of this country almost from the beginning, however qualified that needs to be in terms of the actual history. So there was a tendency, not only with Solzhenitsyn, but the dissidents generally, to see them as sort of little Western liberals who just happened to be born on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. And they were fighting our fight in the Cold War from within the behemoth itself, within the Soviet Union. And Solzhenitsyn was some of the most ferocious critiques of Soviet history came from Solzhenitsyn. He did not pull punches, and he just seemed to be utterly fearless, no matter what threats were issued. He was such a problem for the Soviet government. And I read the transcripts of the Politburo meetings where Brezhnev and his comrades discussed, what do we do with Solzhenitsyn? And they discussed that problem over and over and over again. They really couldn't figure out what to do. They didn't actually discuss this explicitly. Should they have him killed? I mean, that was obviously an option for the KGB. There is some evidence that there was an attempted poisoning of Solzhenitsyn in Novocherkassk. Okay, so maybe they shouldn't kill him. That smells like Stalinism. They don't want to tip back into political violence that way. Should they exile him to Siberia? Should they arrest him? Should they put him in a mental institution? Should they put him on trial? They went back and forth and couldn't decide.
They had no idea. They didn't know what to do with it.
How do you deal with a guy like this who just, won't take no for an answer? And eventually what they decided to do was simply expel him from the country. This is in early 1974. Expel him from the country, literally put him on an airplane to Germany. You're out of here. And then strip him of his citizenship. It was only after Solzhenitsyn arrived in the West that his fans, and there were many by that point, he'd already received the Nobel Prize in 1970, largely for his novels and the Gulag Archipelago. It was only after he arrived in the West, people started to listen to what he had to say about the future of Russia. And that's when people realized, oh, this guy's not a Democrat. He's not a liberal. He's a deeply religious man. He's a Russian nationalist. He's not a right-wing fanatic, but the the ideal Russia that he envisions is not going to have a multi-party system. It's going to have an authoritarian government. People also discovered that he was an environmentalist. He did not like the Industrial Revolution. He did not like urban industrial civilization, and he wanted to return Russia to a kind of primordial, rural, wholesome set of values. He was an anti-modernist, in other words. Mm-hmm. And all kinds of wrinkles started to appear in the relationship to Solzhenitsyn on people who had earlier lionized him. But none of that, in my estimation, can take away from the extraordinary one-man critique of a system that did huge reputational damage to the Soviet Union.
It's interesting how people can they can be very good at some things. Very, very, very good. But, we contain multitudes, right? We got a lot of different parts to us. And it really sounds like he's a kind of a Russian nationalist in some ways, right? Which is it's very interesting. I believe he was an atheist as well. Is that right? But then he's also an environmentalist.
Not an atheist. He was a Russian Orthodox believer, a practicing Christian. Mm. He had, as a young man, he was an atheist, and also
maybe that's what it was. Yeah,
a supporter of the communist system. But he had a series of sort of transformative experiences. One of them was being arrested and sentenced to the Gulag for 8 years. That'll change a man's mind. Another one was a near-death experience with cancer, which will also change your mind and change the way you look at your life and your relationship to the world. So, I just want to say on the face of it, there's nothing wrong with being a Russian nationalist. It just depends what kind of nationalism you subscribe to. And in Solzhenitsyn's case, he came out very early, which means by the late 1970s, arguing that Russia had no business presiding over places like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, all of the Central Asian republics. And he very early, and this was controversial within the Russian nationalist camp, he called for breaking up the Soviet Union and retaining only the Slavic peoples as part of a single state, meaning Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, and letting all of the non-Slavic minority populations of the Soviet Union, let them go, let them pursue their own historical destinies. Now, today in 2024, people wince when they hear that because they say, oh, well, Solzhenitsyn didn't recognize Ukraine as an independent state. He thought the Slavic peoples all belonged together. And I'd be the first to admit that's a problematic position to take.
Sure.
But again, we have to take into account the context in the 1970s and 80s in which Solzhenitsyn was saying that. And, he was saying to Russian nationalists, we have no business governing the affairs of the Uzbeks or the Lithuanians.
Sure, yeah.
A lot of Russian nationalists did not want to hear that at the time. So in its time, it was a very bold statement on his part.
When we think about the dissident movement, how do you feel it sits with other civil rights movements around the world that we know of? So you mentioned, India, you mentioned here in the American South. I'm sure there's certain movements in Latin America and around the world. What do you think it kind of sits? I guess we talked about earlier the civil disobedience versus civil obedience, which is very, very fascinating. It's very, very. I don't know how unique it is, but you don't hear about it often, I guess. How do you think it just kind of sits with what they were doing? As they moved from throughout the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, right before the fall of Soviet Union. Where do you think it kind of sits?
Yeah. So one of the things that really struck me when I was working on this book was how similar the dissident movements in the other Soviet-style countries ended up being. So
Mm.
Poland,
Hmm.
Hungary, Czechoslovakia, to a certain extent, even Bulgaria and Romania. I tell this story through the leading characters, beginning with Volpin and others, and you've mentioned some of the others. But I can't deny that there is an incredible structural parallel between the Soviet dissident movement and the dissident movements of those other communist countries. And I can only conclude that there were certain structural issues in those countries, in Soviet style systems, that favored a certain kind of dissident movement. And that's what produced the parallels.
Mm.
Um, Similarly, in China, more recently in China, um, there is a dissident movement that is very much focused on the rule of law and trying to get the Chinese government to honor its own constitution and its own criminal code.
Sure.
And there are differences, to be sure. And one of the most striking differences is that in the Chinese case, there are a lot of lawyers in the dissident movement. These are people who really understand the Chinese legal system from the inside out. Whereas in the Soviet case, it was mostly amateur lawyers. It was people who, by profession, were writers like Solzhenitsyn or physicists like Sakharov. Um, if we widen the net a little bit and ask about civil rights movements outside the socialist world, the American case is very illuminating, and I've described already some of the, especially the contrasts that allow us to see what was distinctive. Another really interesting comparison that I go into briefly in the epilogue of the book is to the resistance movements under the Nazi Empire in the
Mm.
Second World War. There was resistance to the Nazi movement inside Germany, and there was resistance in every country that the Germans either annexed or occupied. And there again, it's the differences that jump out more than the similarities, because I can't find a single example of an anti Nazi resistance movement that tried to leverage Nazi law in
Mm.
an attempt to contain the behavior of the Nazi state.
Mm.
So for me, comparisons and contrasts are very useful when it comes to identifying what was shared and what was distinctive
Hmm.
about this civil rights movement versus others.
Do you think it's partly a is there something in kind of the cultural evolution or the social psychology of why some places might lean towards doing it this way as opposed to others? It's a very, or is it maybe a time thing? What do you think is maybe some kind of underlying thread there, if there is one? I don't want there to do a just so kind of thing, but what do you
Sure.
think about some of that?
Well, the case that I know best is obviously the Russian and Soviet. And I think what calls out for explanation is, why did so few people actually partake in this movement? I've emphasized that the numbers of dissidents were really quite small vis-a-vis the population as a whole. And after a certain period, the Soviet population really proved very unreceptive to the message that the dissidents were broadcasting. They thought that, the rule of law, you're missing the point. This is a government that doesn't care about law. So why are you harping on fidelity to the law? And I think, I hesitate to make generalizations, but I think there is a strong psychological current in Russian political culture that has people afraid of public demonstrations and public disorder.
Mm.
There's a high degree of discomfort with public airing of differences, and in part because of Russia's own history of total societal breakdown in moments like the collapse of communism or the Russian revolutions of 1917.
Mm.
People associate protests with unrest, and they associate unrest with chaos and disorder.
Mm.
And the government uses this fear. It exploits this fear to isolate protesters and dissidents from the rest of the population. And in fact, there's this kind of myth in Russian culture, and it's very widespread in my experience. There's a myth that genuine reform can only happen in that country from the top down.
Hmm.
And during the Soviet period, it was only the Communist Party can reform this society. Any forces outside the party risk total societal breakdown and civil war. And Putin broadcasts the same message. He essentially wants to monopolize politics in Russia. And one of the most striking things about the Putin government is how unconstrained it is. He is not constrained by the constitution of the Russian Federation. He is not constrained by a meaningful parliament. It's just a purely rubber stamp parliament, the Russian Duma, that is. The political party of which Putin is the nominal leader, United Russia, Единая Россия, when has that party ever disagreed with Putin or seriously placed constraints on what he can do? There's no Politburo like there was in the Brezhnev era, where there had to be collective decision making, at least among those 12 guys at the top of the system. Putin is really a solo operator. He can make extremely consequential decisions, more or less, without any formal or institutional constraints. And that is, by definition, an extremely dangerous situation.
Yeah, I want to ask about kind of more current. So obviously, your book isn't about kind of at present, current day, but obviously there is an ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia at the moment, and there has been for, unfortunately, almost 3 years now.
Yep.
If you're a Russian in Russia at the moment, and you don't like what's going on, or if you're folks in the region, how do you look at history and the Soviet Dissident Movement and say, well, you don't have to do it exactly the same way, but what are some things that you can pull from that and say maybe they were onto something here. They had it pretty tough. How could we use some of this, or how can we understand at least some of this stuff to help maybe have some pushback, legitimate pushback? And then more generally, what does the dissident movement kind of teach us, young activist groups and other movements and protests kind of around the world in a kind of modern 21st century?
Yeah. I very much hope that I very much hope that people are asking those questions in Russia today. But I fear that it's much more common than that people aren't asking them, and that they are not aware of this history. And so they can't extract lessons from it if they don't know the history themselves. And even among those who do have some familiarity with it, many have drawn the conclusion that the dissidents failed and that therefore they're not a model to follow. This is something that Alexei Navalny himself was known to have believed, that he did not want to be seen as the heir or the descendant of the dissident movement, because, as he put it, they failed. They failed to topple the Soviet Union. They failed to achieve political power. And that, I think, is the wrong lesson to draw. The first thing to be aware of is that the dissidents did not aspire to topple the Soviet system. For almost all of them, it was unimaginable that you could do such a thing. They may have contributed to the collapse of that system by hollowing out its legitimacy and by exposing the Soviet system as a political unit that could not obey its own laws. And that there's something deeply archaic about that, not being able to obey your own constitution. But here's what I would say, and this gets back to something that we were talking about earlier. I think the story of the Soviet dissident movement, and I do hope this book will reach people in Russia in one form or another, that story can remind people that small numbers of people can make significant inroads into the arc of history. They can bend the arc of history. It has been done not once, but many times in the past. So I think it can act as a kind of antidote towards the hopelessness that can so easily set in a situation like the one you have in Russia today.
Mm.
Whether it will have that effect is impossible for me to say.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lot there, and I think that if people can hear the story, I think that's really, 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 at the very least, a starting point. I guess, and then just generally, we see here in the U.S. Obviously, everyone's got a different history and different story, but you know, we see protests, and we see activist groups, and we see it around the world. We see it in Arab countries, we see it in the Middle East, we see it in Latin America, we see it pretty much everywhere. What can we there's obviously a closer link with Russia today, with how they could learn from this, but how do you think this, what's the translatability, if you will, of this dissident movement in the 20th century in the Soviet Union for other protests or movements around the world? What do you see as that generalizability there, if there is any?
Yeah. Well, there's some cautionary notes to begin with. The dissident turn to a Western public, having essentially failed to capture the loyalty of the Soviet public, was a very powerful thing, but it was also a very dangerous thing because it exposed the movement to the charge that they were operating in the interests of the Cold War opponent of the Soviet Union. It gave them a lot of leverage. It got them huge amounts of global publicity, but it didn't transform the Soviet Union into a law-abiding state vis-a-vis its own population. So the West exerts such a disproportionate influence on global affairs that it's always tempting, to make your protest poster in English so that American journalists will take your picture and you'll make the front page of the the New York Times or the Washington Post. But there's a price that goes along with building bridges to the people who like you the most, as opposed to the people who you really need to bring over to your side. And sometimes that work, bringing local people over to your side, is less glamorous, more frustrating, and slower than simply gaining the attention of Western media. But I do think that even though the rule of law is not the answer to all political problems, I mean, after all, the United States was essentially a law-abiding society, and we got involved in the Vietnam War in a way that was catastrophic, above all for the Vietnamese, but also for the 50,000 American soldiers who never came back from that war because they were killed. But if the rule of law is not sufficient to solve all problems, I do think it's a necessary principle to even begin to approach the most pressing problems of our time. And I think the dissidents did a brilliant job highlighting the centrality of legal norms and law-abiding behavior by states, including abiding by international human rights. I think they did a brilliant job of highlighting those ideas. And you could really say that the Soviet dissidents put human rights on the map thanks to the Cold War. They really brought it to global attention.
Yeah, that will leave you leave your mark, your stamp on history there, which is wonderful to really push for that. Ben, this was such a wonderful conversation. I again very, very, very much loved your book. It's really a masterpiece. I was so enthralled with the conversation to talk about it. Of course, in some ways, I thought the book was too short. It's like, man, there's so many things that you could have got into and could have got into more. And so you cover so much wonderful stuff, and I highly recommend people picking up the book and getting the full kind of download from from what we were talking about here in the book. So it's
Thank you.
just super wonderful, and I really appreciate it. So big thanks for coming on and talking about it.
I want to thank you. You gave that book what was obviously a very careful read. I really appreciate the depth of your engagement and your questions. I will admit, you're the first person who's told me they thought it's not long enough. But I hope it's a good read, and I really appreciate the chance of talking with you about it. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely, yeah.